Due Process, recipient of 2 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards for Outstanding Talk Show Series and Outstanding Public Affairs Series.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.
A Megan's Law target outed in the press, a born-again murderer who couldn't escape her death sentence, an unjustly jailed Newark man who will finally get some satisfaction from the state. Just 3 of the stories on this season's Due Process. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King, and on this, our final show of the season, we look back at where we've been, we report on what's come since, and we start with this year's twist on Megan's Law, when a newspaper decided to take the confidential out of community notification.
I can't talk. I can't say anything now. I'm sorry.
He's one of only 48 men in the state who've been classified as Tier 3 sex offenders. Under Megan's Law, that means his neighbors get the word. But when the local paper put that word on its front page with his picture, notification, some said, had gone out of control.
It moves beyond what the court said was appropriate dissemination of information, because when something is given to a newspaper and it's published on the front page, that publication goes far beyond the likely to encounter zone of notification.
But while the Attorney General was outraged by both the Home News Tribune and the source of the leak, longtime Megan's Law opponents were saying it was just what they had expected all along.
And although this is too serious a matter to say I told you so, I think it is. I think it should cause everyone involved with Megan's Law to reflect and see if these notifications are going to go on, if there's any possible way to prevent this from recurring in the future.
It does mean that much to me. That's why I've come forward.
Other Megan's Law targets, like this man, whose challenge to the law would finally prove unsuccessful, had gone public voluntarily or had been ID'd by private folks. But this was the first case of a Megan's Law offender being outed in the media as direct result of the official process. And the Home News Tribune's editor was making no apologies.
Had been an issue of some public concern, as you well know, the whole Megan Law thing. But no, we didn't hesitate about publishing the story.
And in fact, the Attorney General never did move on either the paper or its source, but that didn't signal open season, as some had warned, on the secrecy that's supposed to surround Megan's Law notification. In fact, Raymond, there had been predictions that we'd have a regular column in every newspaper on the John Does in that community. We haven't seen that happen.
I don't think it's going to happen that way, that every case is going to be tracked, that everybody's going to be exposed. But remember, the press has an interest in and perhaps a duty to go after stories that interest the public. And the next time there's a case that's really of human interest, they're going to go after it, and this issue is going to be back in court.
Megan's Law had a victory in recent months. A defeat for those who have predicted that eventually it would be overturned when the Supreme Court refused to hear the federal appeal, what seemed to be the final federal appeal of Megan's Law here in New Jersey. Is that the end of it?
No, I don't think that's the end of it, but again, Sandy, I think that the direct issue has been resolved, except that the court resolved it by being comfortable that there's this carefully tiered approach by which only selected offenders get exposed. If the newspapers persist in doing what happened in the case we covered, I think the court's going to have to go with this issue again.
And in fact, we remember that the then Chief Justice said, we assume that everyone will respect the confidentiality. You, Lawyer Brown, are predicting won't happen.
No, I don't think so. I think we're going to see more victories, more defeats in that line of cases.
Raymond, you know, there was also a grisly sort of addendum to the Mendequas, Jesse Mendequas, of course, being the person convicted in Megan's murder when his brother recently was arrested, jailed for alleged assault on 2 young women.
That's true, and nobody would have been interested in him had he not been the brother of the man already convicted. So again, the press driving a number of changes in the area of criminal justice.
Right.
Interesting. Well, the parents of Megan Kenka had a win when Jesse Temendicos was sentenced to die. He became the 14th person on New Jersey's death row, which brings us to another major story this season: the execution of Karla Faye Tucker in Texas and the continued controversial delay of any execution here in New Jersey.
It seemed like every bit of anger and violence that was in me was just removed at that point. It was like God just took it out of me.
Her apparent conversion was not enough to keep Karla Faye Tucker from execution, but it may have won some new opposition to capital punishment.
Today we're going to have special prayer again for Karla.
It also focused new national attention on how long it can take from the time the crime is done until the death sentence is finally served.
The grisly discovery was made shortly after 7 this morning.
In Tucker's case, that meant from her 2 pickaxe murders in 1983 until her death by lethal injection 15 years later.
This is the way the system has always been done. I'm saying, let's take a look at the system. That's what I'm hoping the commission will do. Let's take a look at the system, and let's see if we can re-examine that system, which we should do anyway. Any system should be re-examined. And in re-examining it, let's find out whether or not we can shorten it without, and that's very important because you're dealing with a man's life, without doing damage to his appeal.
And that's what New Jersey's now set out to do. With the death penalty back on the books since '82, more than 50 people sentenced to die, and still no execution, the governor's appointed a special commission charged with finding ways to speed up the process.
There are the years and years and years of appeals, hearings, and retrials seemingly without end. Justice delayed is justice denied.
There's little doubt that the governor's commission will do what it was charged to do: come up with ways to speed the time between sentence and execution.
Is it possible to do it, Raymond? Most of the criminal defense attorneys, like yourself, to whom I speak, say, no, 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 you need all of that time. And yet I tell you that the layperson in this state looks at this and says, it is insane. Why would it take 13, 15, 17 years to get from the sentence of death to the execution?
The simple answer is, Sandy, it's not taking that long anymore. The federal courts, which still review state court convictions, have greatly, actually the Congress, have greatly reduced the time the federal courts can take to look at an appeal. And now the same thing is happening in New Jersey. But the balance that always has to be struck, given the finality of the punishment here, is, are we making sure that everybody got the fair trial? Proponents and opponents of the death penalty alike ought to be concerned that if we do execute anybody, it ought to be somebody who's had a full run at having his conviction reviewed.
Can you have a full run in what might seem to most people like a reasonable amount of time? 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, closer to, say, what Texas is starting to try to do?
Texas is not a model for us. It's in the death belt. Representation is poor, and the issues that come out of Texas are horrible. We don't want to even approximate that. I think we ought not to be focused primarily on time. It can be made shorter than 15 or 20 years, but we ought to be concerned about justice first.
You know, there are a number of suggestions that are coming before that commission, and one of them is to do away with proportionality review. So first, tell us what that is.
Proportionality actually means, it's a rare event, what it sounds like. It means that the punishment fits the crime. That is, if everybody who does a certain kind of crime gets the same kind of punishment. It also implicates race, because what we know is that the race of the victim and the race of the defendant, as well as class considerations, profoundly affect who gets executed. What they're trying to say is either not make that mandatory because the Constitution doesn't require it, or make it happen earlier in the process and not be the subject of a whole separate appellate process.
And if capital punishment raises strong public feeling, and it does, how the system deals with drugs sparks even greater dispute. In the last few decades, we've seen the drug laws get increasingly tough. Mandatory sentences, drug-free school zones, those were moving in one direction. The drug court is moving in another.
Are you going to get locked up today?
No.
Okay. So
I'm not going
for
to get
today,
drunk either.
and you're not going to get drunk. So for today, you are okay. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let's live with that today.
And tomorrow we'll deal with that tomorrow. Okay. Okay? Okay, thank you, Ron. Okay, we'll see you next week.
It seems less like a court than a 12-step program, more like a sympathetic counseling session than a criminal being brought to justice.
Okay, so he'll be coming every week.
Okay. Okay, so you're not on the waiting list.
Yeah.
You're in.
All right.
And we'll see you next Tuesday afternoon, okay?
Okay. Thank you. And in a sense, it's both. This is a real courtroom. This is a real judge. But it's not your ordinary kind of court.
We require somebody that is drug dependent, is nonviolent, and has a limited criminal history.
This is Drug Court, Camden County, New Jersey's first, and it's a whole new way of dealing with drug crime.
Having to not be able to do what I want to do anymore, you know what I'm saying?
All of them have a history of serious drug abuse and addiction, but with habits to support, most also became small-time drug dealers.
Part of the job is distinguishing between people who are selling drugs as a lucrative business, because they are people who are in it for the money, from people who are merely selling drugs in order to support their own habit.
Some even sold within 1,000 feet of a school. So whatever became of those mandatory sentences?
What happened is that at the same time that the calls continue for cracking down on drug-related crime, there's another growing movement to view drug addiction as a disease that can and should be treated.
So who in the end will win this fight? It seems to me that we're in an almost schizophrenic phase here, where on one hand there is this get tough on crime, which means, at least for street crime, get tough, and other kinds of crime as well, get tough on drugs. And then there is what we saw in the 5-hour Bill Moyers public television series last month, this driving home of the idea that this is a disease and shouldn't be treated like crime. Who wins?
Schizophrenic's a good word. Another concept is pendulum. Remember, the concept that drug addiction is a disease is an old one. It's been kicked around for 30 years at least. We've only just begun here in New Jersey and a few other states to be willing to view it that way and devote some resources. The question is, can we ever catch up? We devote enough resources to make a dent in the population of drug-addicted people, especially those in and out of prison. That's really the question.
But we remember in the early 70s when the really stiff mandatory sentences came into being, this cry for doing away with drugs. Of course, that hasn't worked. Is it just that the society is throwing up its hands and saying, let's try something different?
Well, I don't think that's been completely abandoned. It's still good politics for a legislator to talk about how tough he is on drugs. But I think increasingly there is a sense that there needs to be another arm, perhaps some marriage in the long haul between serious commitment to treating it as a disease and still cracking down on people who deal but are not addicted.
This season on Due Process, we saw drug court. Last year, we saw a residential in-prison drug treatment program, and we heard the woman who runs that program tell us that almost everybody in state prison needs that kind of program. I'm here to tell you that while we have not seen every person getting treated, the state just sent out another press release that another program is opening. Mandatory sentences, however, I will predict will not be pulled off.
No, I don't think so. And I think the problem is going to be, are we willing to devote sufficient resources for a long enough time, especially to make a dent in prisons where we believe that maybe half the people there have a drug problem of some kind?
That is indeed the question, but drug addiction is not the only plague we find ourselves forced to cope with. And the policy questions for AIDS and HIV are just as many, just as tough. And as with drugs, there's a move afoot to find new answers. For some, that means worrying less about confidentiality than about containment of the virus, beginning with more aggressive, more intrusive reporting of HIV names and cases.
Why? Because this is big. This is all over the world, you know? People out there sick, they don't even know they're sick.
And Lourdes Collazo is not the only AIDS patient at Newark's Broadway house who thinks the state does not go far enough when it comes to testing and reporting HIV. They say there should be more of both.
Your name should be reported. It should be put on a list. You know what I'm saying? People should should be aware of your sickness.
For the residents of this nursing home, keeping the virus secret is no longer an option. Confidentiality, no longer an issue.
They don't have to worry about that no more.
But the worry remains for those who are asymptomatic but infected with HIV and for most AIDS advocates. New Jersey already requires reporting of names for most of those who test positive for the virus. But if preventing the spread is really the idea, why not be more aggressive? In this state, why not do more than just file names? Why not require testing, especially among high-risk groups? And when the test proves positive, why not follow up?
It's impossible to track down who, you know, if you had more than one partner, because each partner you sleep with, you're sleeping with the individuals that they've slept with if you're having unsafe sex.
But advocates of the more aggressive approach say you've got to start somewhere. They say it makes no sense to be more aggressive with syphilis or tuberculosis than with AIDS and HIV. Of course, Raymond, there are the arguments on the other side, too.
Sandy, the key argument is the question of discrimination. Once you've publicly identified a person or allowed a person to be known as having the virus, the question is that person going to be discriminated against in terms of housing, jobs, or even on a social basis? And we really haven't come up with an answer for that. This is indeed a complex problem.
True, and yet as we know, that was the attitude that has held sway in most of the country, and certainly here in New Jersey, and even more so in New York, where names aren't even reported to the state, until recently. And now I think we're seeing a change, and it's because the medicine has changed. In fact, we now have cocktails that can keep people alive a lot longer, that can keep full-blown AIDS at bay. So you've got lots more HIV-infected people who are really invisible, who can be infecting other people, and after all, the argument goes, why not do what you do, say, with syphilis or tuberculosis? Track down contacts, follow up, do interviews, not publish names in a newspaper, but in fact, get tough with trying to keep the virus in check.
Well, Sandy, the question is, if people live longer, are there going to be even more problems with the discrimination side of this argument?
Well, and in fact, we keep hearing that there has to be, a balance between the two, but let me just note that Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York has finally said, at least in New York, they're willing to see names reported.
That's true. Well, there are a couple of themes that have appeared and reappeared in our last 3 seasons. And because in this culture you can't look at justice without considering color, one of those themes has been race. Despite significant gains, it remains the American dilemma, and the disputes still rage on about how to address it. But the national debate this season focused on New Jersey, and a case that could have had national impact.
2 high school business teachers, one black, one white, hired the same day with roughly the same credentials. When one had to go, the board furloughed Sharon Taxman, saying race was the reason for retaining Deborah Williams. The one black teacher in their department, Sharon Taxman, filed suit.
If the board had flipped a coin as they would normally do, they might have ended up with a situation where there would have been totally non-diverse teaching faculty in that department, and that troubled them.
It's very simple. She was doing her job. She did a very good job. And because of a freak of nature being born white, she was on the unemployment line.
Taxman did eventually get her job back, but the case continued, with federal wins for her in trial court and appellate court. The case was set for hearing before the highest court, when a coalition of civil rights groups stepped in.
Because given the composition of the Supreme Court and the rulings that have been coming down, there was a fear that there would be an adverse ruling that would gut a lot of affirmative action programs around the country.
So the Civil Rights Coalition averted the dreaded showdown, and of the $433,000 that the school board agreed to pay to Taxman, 2/3 was paid by the Black Leadership Forum.
There will, of course, be more cases to come. The hope among advocates of affirmative action is that the next case will be less of a likely loser. There has already been some erosion in the courts, but the big losses lately have been at the polls. California and Texas have, by referendum, banned any consideration of race or past wrongs based on race in education or employment. Other states are considering similar votes, and while New Jersey doesn't allow for initiative and referendum, there is a bill pending that would ban affirmative action here too.
True, Sandy. I think our discussion here maybe led to the conclusion that that bill is not going to overwhelm us, but the issue remains. It's still a deep divide. One of the things that may help affirmative action advocates is the absolute disastrous results in California and Texas, where educational system has seen dramatic declines in admissions of minorities, not just to graduate schools, law school, but to colleges, public colleges. That's a profound implication, and sooner or later that may have some impact here in New Jersey.
But let's talk candidly about public attitudes on this. What you see as disastrous, somebody else may see as only fair.
Well, actually, nobody says it's good that there's a reduction in numbers, but you're right. Those who oppose affirmative action say, look, it only proves that the blacks and Latinos and those who were there before didn't deserve to be there
in the first place. And I wonder in New Jersey what you think the sentiment is. It's interesting that nobody in the legislature wants to take this up, and yet I suspect that public opinion is, white public opinion, more and more against affirmative action.
I think you're right, but I think sooner or later we have to look at the question of what are the practical steps being taken to create more possibilities and opportunities for minority kids in the educational system, because the answer that affirmative action opponents haven't come up with is how to get more kids into the pipeline. And just as race is dominant in education, there's no escaping the fact that race has an impact on our criminal justice system every day, and that race was undoubtedly a factor in the horrors that befell an innocent Newark teenager who paid for an official mistake with the greatest part of his adult life.
Saying this guy did me wrong, that guy, that's not going to solve anything.
But
that's
the whole
not gonna
system did you wrong. Surely you're angry.
But the system also righted the wrong that they did.
But that took most of this man's adult life. Nearly 12 years in state prison for a rape he didn't do. And even once he was back outside, cleared at last by DNA testing, for David Shepard, the fight for fair treatment was still far from over.
There's no recourse for me.
There's nobody for you to sue?
Nobody. Nobody.
That was because New Jersey, unlike, say, New York, did not allow lawsuits from the wrongly convicted, wrongly jailed. So Shepard found himself on a janitor's paycheck, trying to rebuild a life brutally and unjustly shattered when he went to prison, an innocent man at age 19. How much are you looking for?
Roughly around $220,000.
Not much in exchange for nearly 12 years, but enough to change your life.
Right, enough to help me do the things that I want to do for my family. Not all of them, but some of them. Gives me a start, somewhere to start from.
It's a start that comes courtesy of an act of the legislature, which changed the law last June to allow David Shepard and anyone else who can prove he should not have been imprisoned to seek compensation for years stolen by the system.
Not until after the interview. The interview we did, the first interview we did, really, I think it piqued people's interest and people got involved, and the letters that we had sent before suddenly got returned.
And after due process first told Shepard's story, the large, quiet man with the steady smile found himself in a media spotlight.
Been on maybe about 5 or 6 different national shows and syndicated shows.
All starting with due process?
All starting with due process.
In fact, the David Shepard story was the first we told at the start of our first season 2 years ago. It's a story we update each year, a story that goes to the heart of the American justice system and its issues. And the good news in this update is that David is a little closer to getting his money.
He hasn't gotten it yet, Raymond, but it does look like there will be something in the $200,000, $220,000 range. Not much for 12 years of your life, and yet more than David Shepard could have ever hoped to have seen. The holdup, it seems, in part now is that his lawyer, who has worked to try to get him this money for the last 2 years, thinks he should be paid. The state thinks he should be paid relatively little, so the fight goes on. But that's really not the important part of the David Shepard story.
It's true. The important part of the David Shepard story is, I guess, number one, we always have to admit you can't put any price on liberty. But David did 12 years, and there was a reversal of his conviction.
We should say it was because of DNA. Had this been before DNA time, or had David not been quick enough to have followed in the newspapers that there was this thing called DNA and perhaps it could clear him? Had there not been a second defendant, so the rape kit was kept? I mean, everything went wrong for David initially, but then everything went right and he was cleared thanks to science.
And can you connect this to our death penalty discussion?
Absolutely. It is the argument, is the ultimate argument against the death penalty. If in fact you can concede that a David Shepard went to jail for 12 years for a rape and a kidnapping he didn't do, then the argument goes that how can you send somebody to death when in fact there could be an innocent person on that table?
Even affects the time limit arguments, because we were talking earlier about reducing it down to 7 or 8 years. 5 years, David would have been gone for 5 years before he had a chance to really bring about his own liberation.
Although I'll bet there are some who would say that even so, I'm not ready to quite to concede that point. 15 years is an awfully long time.
But it shows that the focus on years is the wrong focus. The focus should be on justice and a result we can all live with, especially when it's so final.
Well, Raymond, it is appropriate that we end this season where we started due process with David Shepard and his story of what happens when the justice system goes wrong. We'll be back to his story again when we return with an all-new due process series.
So if you've missed any one of our shows, you can catch us in reruns. And come back to us next season when we start up again with a new set of programs on law and justice and, of course, due process. Till then, for Sandy King, Henrietta Parker, Jeff Friedman, and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown.
Anger and violence that was in me was just removed at that point. It was like God just took it out of me.
Why? Because this is big. This is all over the world, you know? People out there sick, they don't even know they're sick.
We call on all citizens, including members of the media, to abide by Megan's Law, both the spirit of the law and the letter of the law.
There was a fear that there would be an adverse ruling that would gut a lot of affirmative action programs around the country.
Yelling, screaming, yelling, hollering, saying this guy did me wrong, that guy, that's not going to solve anything.
But the whole system did you wrong. Surely you're angry.
But the system also righted the wrong that they did.
Major funding for due process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.